The air was thin, crisp, a biting cold that seemed to sharpen every sound. Snow crunched underfoot as Marco Siffredi, a lean young man of 19 with wild black hair and eyes that burned with an almost otherworldly intensity, carved effortlessly down a steep powder-filled couloir on his snowboard. He was a blur of neon gear against the stark white canvas of Les Grands Montets in Chamonix, a master of his domain. His best friend and videographer, Pascal, a bundled-up figure in his 20s, laden with camera gear, struggled to keep pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Marco, slow down, you maniac!" Pascal yelled, his words snatched and whipped away by the wind, barely audible over Marco's joyous, uninhibited laughter. Marco, exhilarated, expertly sprayed snow in Pascal's face, then executed a perfect 360 spin, landing flawlessly, as if gravity itself bowed to his will. "The mountain sings to me, Pascal." Marco grinned, breathless but alive. "It tells me where to go." They reached the bottom of the run, and Marco kicked off his board, his face flushed with the pure, untamed joy of his descent. Pascal, still panting, looked at him with a mix of awe and concern. "One wrong move, and it's a very cold, very long sleep. You think about that." Marco's gaze drifted upwards, to the towering peaks, a distant, almost spiritual longing in his eyes. "Every time, that's the thrill, the razor's edge." He paused, then his voice dropped, a quiet declaration of destiny. "Someday, Pascal, someday." The biggest one. Marco Siffredi wasn't merely a snowboarder. He was a pioneer, a young prodigy hailing from the heart of Chamonix, France. He lived for the untamed slopes, for the thrilling embrace of danger, and the constant push against established limits. He was forever redefining what was considered possible on a snowboard. Yet, even for a man who found his truest self on the precipice, teetering on the edge of the known, Mount Everest loomed as an entirely different kind of beast. 3 years later, in 2001, sunlight streamed through a dusty window in a trekking agency in Kathmandu. Marco, now older, his features more seasoned, was hunched over a topographical map of Everest. Beside him stood Ferber Tashi, a sherpa in his 40s, his presence calm and observant, his eyes holding the wisdom of countless ascents. Marco's finger traced a perilous line on the map. "The Hornbein couloir, it's steep, exposed, but it's the fastest descent. If I can get to the top, Ferber pointed to a particularly treacherous section. This part, very dangerous. Ice rock, many have died here. The wind, it can rip you from the mountain." Marco's eyes, however, were shining, reflecting the audacious dream taking shape in his mind. That's where the challenge is, where the ultimate line lies. Soon after, a cacophony of sounds enveloped Everest base camp, the incessant whipping of wind, the rhythmic flap of tents, the distant ominous cracking of ice. Marco, Pascal, and Ferber stood amidst the bustling tent city. Equipment was being meticulously checked, oxygen tanks stacked in neat rows, each click and clank a testament to the immense undertaking ahead. Pascal, looking around at the sheer scale of the operation, felt a familiar surge of unease. "This is insane, Marco. Look at this place. It's a meat grinder." Marco, adjusting his goggles, just gave a grim smile. "It's magnificent, and it's calling." In the spring of 2001, Marco Siffredi launched his first attempt to snowboard Mount Everest from its summit. His chosen target, the Northern Couloir, a notoriously challenging chute on the north face. What he couldn't have known then, what only the mountain itself truly understood, was that Everest possessed a chilling knack for revealing vulnerabilities, even in the most prepared, a silent, powerful way of setting the stage for an even darker, more desperate encounter. A tiny figure against the immense white, Marco began his descent down the Northern Couloir. He was graceful, flowing down the steep slope with an almost liquid ease. Pascal filmed from a safe distance, his camera struggling to remain steady against the relentless wind. Suddenly, a loud, cracking sound echoed across the frozen landscape. Marco stumbled. His board skidded violently on a patch of bare ice. He struggled desperately to regain control, narrowly averting a catastrophic fall into a deep, unforgiving crevasse. Pascal's voice, narrating later, would recall, "He got lucky that day. Pure luck. A patch of ice. Unexpected." He aborted the descent, shaken, but the taste of Everest, it was in his blood now. He knew he had to go back. The lively Chamonix bar buzzed with chatter and laughter, But Marco was withdrawn, his focus elsewhere. He sketched intricate lines on a cocktail napkin, his mind clearly miles away. Up in the unforgiving heights, he yearned to return to Pascal, his loyal friend and companion on countless adventures, watched him, a knot of concern tightening in his gut. "You're going back, aren't you, to Everest?" Marco's distant gaze softened momentarily as he nodded. "Hornbein, it's the ultimate line. Nobody's ever done it." Pascal's voice was laced with a desperate plea. "For a reason, Marco. It's a death trap. Ice falls, avalanches, and that damn wind." But Marco, looking up, his eyes alight with grim determination, was unswayed. "I can do it. I have to." Against the earnest advice of many, including his closest friends and worried family, Marco Siffredi returned to Everest in the summer of 2002. This time, his ambition had swelled, grown grander, and his target was undeniably more audacious. The Hornbein. This particular route was so treacherous, so unforgiving, that it had only been successfully climbed a mere handful of times in all of history, let alone contemplated for a snowboard descent. It was a line that called to a certain kind of spirit, one that walked the very edge of human capability. Everest Base Camp was quieter now, the summer monsoon season creeping in with its ominous promise of storms and unpredictable conditions. Marco's team was smaller this time: himself, Pascal, Ferber, Toshi, and a few other Sherpas, their faces already etched with the strain of the high altitude and the immense challenge ahead. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Ferber, Toshi, ever the pragmatic guide, reiterated the grim reality. "The weather window is very small, Marco. The monsoon clouds are building. We must be quick." Marco, his determination unwavering, simply replied, "We will be." That night, inside their tent at base camp, Marco was restless. He stared intently at a satellite phone, its silent presence a conduit to the world below that now seemed so distant. Pascal watched him, a silent observer of his friend's inner turmoil. Any word from home? They're worried sick. Marco finally spoke, his voice quiet, tinged with a flicker of vulnerability. "My wife. She asked me not to go. Said she had a bad feeling." Pascal, seizing the moment, pressed him. "Listen to her. Listen to the mountain. It's telling you something, Marco." But Marco, consumed by his singular focus, ignored the plea. His unwavering gaze was fixed on the unseen summit. The summit push began in early September. The conditions were far from ideal. The snow, initially soft and mushy from a recent, deceptive warmth, then froze to a dangerous, slick glare ice at higher altitudes. This wasn't the champagne powder Marco, the powder maestro, dreamed of. These were warning signs, subtle, insidious whispers, from a mountain that tolerates no compromise, no deviation from its brutal rules. The climb was arduous. Marco, Pascal, and the Sherpas moved slowly, deliberately, roped together against the vast, indifferent expanse. The wind picked up, starting as a low growl, then rising to a deafening roar. Pascal's camera struggled to focus, its lens almost useless against the swirling white. "This wind is brutal, Marco." He strained to be heard, his voice almost ripped from his throat. Marco just nodded, his face grim, his entire being focused on the unrelenting ascent. Altitude sickness was a constant, debilitating companion. Headaches hammered behind their eyes, nausea churned in their stomachs, and a bone-deep fatigue sapped every ounce of strength. The air thinned with every agonizing step, and the mind, deprived of oxygen, played cruel tricks. Yet, Marco pushed on, driven by an almost obsessive desire to conquer this ultimate challenge, to complete the line he had envisioned. Finally, they stood on the summit of Everest, the world stretching out below them in a dizzying panorama of jagged peaks and swirling clouds. Marco stood beside his snowboard, a triumphant, yet tiny figure against the immensity. The wind was a fierce, constant roar, threatening to tear them from the roof of the world. He removed his oxygen mask for a moment, his breath clouding in the sub-zero air. "We made it, Pascal. We made it," he rasped, his voice weak, but filled with a triumphant glint in his eye. He replaced his mask, adjusted his bindings, and looked down. The view was magnificent, awe-inspiring, but also terrifying. Below, the Hornbein couloir plunged into the abyss, a steep, dark line of ice and rock, beckoning him towards his fate. Pascal's later narration would simply state, he stood on top of the world. For a moment, he was invincible. But Everest always has the last word. Marco clipped into his snowboard, the sharp click of the bindings echoing faintly in the thin air. On the summit of Everest, Pascal, his hands shaking from the intense cold and gnawing nerves, prepared his camera, its worry a fragile sound against the mountain's roar. Ferber, Tashi, and the other Sherpas watched with grim, knowing faces, their silence a heavy shroud. "Be careful, Marco. The snow is not good," Ferber warned, his voice low but firm. Marco, his reply muffled by his oxygen mask, simply stated, "I know, but it's now or never." With a burst of pure, unadulterated determination, he pushed off people. He was incredibly fast, carving sharp, precise turns down the initial slope, a human comet streaking across the vast white expanse. Pascal zoomed in, his lens struggling to keep Marco's fleeting figure in frame. The first few turns were classic Marco, aggressive, precise, defying gravity with every fluid movement. He navigated the upper sections of the Hornbein couloir with a confidence born of years spent on the world's steepest slopes, a seemingly effortless dance with danger. But as he entered the couloir itself, the mountain's true, brutal nature began to assert itself. The angle of the slope increased dramatically, plunging steeply into the abyss. Marco's movements, once so effortless, became labored, strained. He hit a patch of seemingly soft powder, which then gave way to rock-hard, unforgiving ice beneath. His edges scraped, a chilling, grating sound that tore through the air. He was barely in control, fighting the mountain with every fiber of his being. Pascal, narrating later, would recall the desperate scene. He was going too fast. The conditions were changing by the second. The wind was picking up, swirling the snow, blinding him. A sudden fierce gust of wind tore across the couloir, momentarily engulfing Marco in a blinding whiteout. When the snow finally cleared, he was still there, a tiny, struggling figure. But now, much further down the treacherous slope, he tried desperately to turn, to regain control, but his board slipped again, then again. The graceful descent transformed into a desperate, frantic fight for survival, a brutal struggle against insurmountable odds. Communications, already a challenge at such extreme altitudes, became sporadic. The intense cold rapidly drained battery life from their radios, and the relentless wind made clear contact almost impossible. Ferber and Pascal were losing sight of him, relying on fleeting glimpses through the swirling snow, their hearts pounding with a terrifying dread. Marco, still a tiny, almost imperceptible figure against the vastness, was moving erratically now. He was no longer carving, no longer flowing. He was sliding, fighting, clawing his way down the mountain. He disappeared behind a jagged rock outcrop, swallowed by the swirling white. "Marco, do you copy?" Pascal yelled into his radio, his voice cracking with fear and desperation. "Marco." Only a chilling static answered him. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. Ferber, Tashi scanned the mountain with binoculars, his face etched with a profound dread, the kind only a veteran of these unforgiving peaks could truly understand. He lowered the binoculars, his voice barely a whisper to Pascal. "He is gone." Pascal, tears streaming down his face, freezing instantly in the sub-zero air, cried out, "No, he can't be." "Marco." They waited. Minutes stretched into an hour, then more. The only sound was the relentless, mocking roar of the wind, echoing the emptiness that now filled their hearts. The search began almost immediately. A desperate, futile effort launched into the unforgiving embrace of Everest. Ferber, Tashi and the Sherpa team, their courage unwavering, risked their own lives, descending into the couloir as far as humanly possible, defying the mountain's deadly grip. But they found nothing. No body, no snowboard, not a single trace. Ferber, Tashi, exhausted and heartbroken, eventually stood at the edge of a sheer drop, gazing into the vastness below him. The couloir vanished into a maze of treacherous icefalls and hidden crevasses, an impassable, deadly terrain. He spoke quietly to Pascal, his voice thick with resignation. The mountain took him. Marco Siffredi vanished on September 8, 2002. His disappearance fueled immediate speculation. An avalanche, a fall into a crevasse, or simply the mountain claiming another victim, erasing any trace as if he had never existed. The truth, in its brutal simplicity, was that in those conditions, survival was not an option. For over 2 decades, Marco Siffredi's disappearance has remained one of Everest's most enduring and chilling mysteries. His story transformed into a cautionary tale, a stark testament to the mountain's raw, indifferent power. But for those who knew him intimately, for those who loved him, and for those who dedicate their lives to studying the unpredictable beast that is Everest, the question was never if he had died, but how it became utterly impossible for him to survive. In a meticulous, almost clinical investigative journalist's office in Chamonix, Sarah, a sharp, meticulous woman in her 40s, stared at a large corkboard. It was plastered with haunting photos of Marco, his vibrant youth captured forever, alongside detailed topographical maps of Everest and faded news clippings chronicling his brief, brilliant career and tragic end. She took a slow sip of cold coffee, the bitter taste mirroring the grim facts laid out before her. Sarah reviewed old weather reports, methodically highlighting sections with a red marker, noting the ferocious high winds and the treacherously changing snow conditions on the very day of Marco's disappearance. Her voice, narrating her findings, was calm, almost detached, yet imbued with a profound gravity. The data tells a chilling story. The conditions on the Hornbein couloir that day were a perfect storm. Later, Sarah conducted a video call with Dr. Anna Sharma, a leading expert in high-altitude physiology and mountain rescue. Dr. Sharma, a woman in her 50s with an authoritative yet compassionate demeanor, listened intently before answering Sarah's crucial question. Dr. Sharma, in your expert opinion, what were the primary factors that made survival impossible for Marco Siffredi on that descent? Dr. Sharma's voice was calm, definitive. Multiple compounding factors. First, the physiological stress at 8,000 meters. Even with supplementary oxygen, the human body is quite literally dying. Cognition is severely impaired, decision-making is compromised, and physical responses are dulled. Then, the extreme weather, wind gusts that could easily exceed 100 kilometers per hour, powerful enough to rip a person clean from the slope. The snow conditions, the treacherous mix of soft, unstable powder overlaying hard, dangerous ice. This makes controlled snowboarding nearly impossible, especially on such an incredibly steep, exposed couloir. She then pointed to a detailed diagram of a hidden crevasse, and finally, the terrain itself. The Hornbein is riddled with hidden crevasses, massive icefalls, and sheer, unforgiving drops. A single misstep, a moment of disorientation in a sudden whiteout, and you could simply vanish into the mountain's depths, never to be seen again. The sheer scale of Everest, its vast and chilling indifference, means that when something goes catastrophically wrong at extreme altitude, rescue is often not just difficult, but entirely impossible, and recovery, even more so. The mountain, in its ancient and brutal way, devours its fallen, often holding them captive for decades, or sometimes, quite simply, forever. Back in Chamonix, in the familiar bar, Pascal, now an older man with lines of grief etched deeply onto his face, sat at the same table he had once shared with his friend. He clutched a framed photograph of Marco, young and vibrant, frozen in time. He was the best, Pascal whispered, his voice hoarse with unspoken pain. Fearless. But Everest, ... Everest doesn't care how good you are. It just ... is. He looked out the window at the distant snow-capped peaks, a silent testament to Marco's ambition and fate. I think about him every day. What those last moments were like. The cold, the silence. Did he know? Did he regret it? The enduring sadness of Marco Siffredi's case lies not merely in his abrupt disappearance, but in the mountain's cold, logical refusal to allow survival. It wasn't an act of malice. It was a simple, brutal display of physics, an environment of overwhelming natural power. No human, no matter how skilled, how courageous, can truly conquer Everest. They can only, for a brief, glorious moment, pass through its domain, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, they never leave. A sweeping, majestic drone shot now paints the screen, showing the Hornbein couloir. It looks as formidable and unforgiving as ever, untouched by human ambition, pristine and deadly. The wind whistles, an ancient, sorrowful sound that carries through the empty vastness. The immense white stretches into the horizon, holding its secrets silently, eternally. Marco Siffredi embarked on a dream, a quest for the ultimate line. But on the merciless slopes of Everest, the line between triumph and tragedy can be as thin as the very air itself. And in the face of such overwhelming, indifferent power, Survival isn't a matter of skill or courage, but simply an impossibility.